Well, one question that I get often is, like, how do we know the way the Romans spoke Latin, right? Like, it makes sense.
Right.
And so the other night, actually it was last week in class, some of the students asked me, like, well, what books do you read? And I said, well, on my nightstand right now there are 3 books. There's Timothy Keller's book on prayer. There's The Two Towers, Tolkien. And then there's this book that I'm doing a summer workshop on at the NOMS conference in Fort Worth this summer, which is, it's basically a 2,000-year-old treatise on how the Romans used to educate kids and kind of best practices from ancient Rome, which is awesome. It dates from just a little bit after the time of Christ. So anyway, so I was like, it's pretty diverse what I might have any given night. So I was going through the reading, and we're going to actually come to this quote, because there are certain words. Hemingway talked about iceberg phrases, and there are phrases that carry a lot of depth, even though they may not have a lot of words. And he means a lot more than just kind of maxims or things with punch. But anyway, this is a line with punch. But I want to give you an example. So this is a guy named Quintilian, or we call him Quintilian. And he's writing about how, what should kids learn from the very earliest. So actually, it's really interesting, which is why I'm doing a whole hour on it. So I'll get that tape and I'll record it and I'll share it. But it's called, we call it, some translations are like Institutes of Oratory. Or in Latin, Institutio, hold on, I feel like it should be the genitive, right? Institutio Oratoria, oops, sorry, the adjective. So basically we translate it as the teaching of rhetoric, or even just how the Romans educated, basically, is how we could translate it. But he goes on, and he has, at the beginning, he has this whole section comparing Greek grammar with Latin grammar and pronunciation and things like that.
Huh.
So actually, you come across a sentence like this. So I would say this to any, for example, like modern Italian or churchman who wants to quote me, well, that's not the right way to say it. So here, I'll just read verbatim. I guess trust me that I'm reading it verbatim and not altering it. I mentioned the fact, so he's talking about, should we have the Greek letter kappa? So throughout he's going back and forth with Greek and Latin. So you kind of have to track on both languages. So he says, well, what about, because we've brought in the Greek, I can't remember the Greek, I think he gives gamma, no, not gamma, he gives upsilon, I think, as an example. Anyway, so he says, well, what about the Greek letter kappa, which makes the k sound? And then he says this, as for kappa, my view is that it should not be used at all, except in such words as may be indicated by the letter standing alone as an abbreviation. So that is, we should only use K if we use it as an abbreviation. So some words that could be abbreviated K would be calends, which would be the first of the month, or calendai, which would be like firsts of months, Carthago, which oftentimes is spelled with a C, but the Carthaginians themselves would have spelled it with a K. So anyway, he gives, okay, we could use it for this reason, just as abbreviations. Because, listen to what he says, because we should not use it because the existence of the letter C, i.e. in Latin we have the letter C, which maintains its force in conjunction with all the vowels. That is, we don't need a hard k sound because we have a hard k sound all the time.
Right.
No matter what vowel follows C, Latin C, it always maintains its force. So that's Quintilian's kind of digressing on style. So he's actually, in this digression that we're going to get to, it's a very long digression. It's about 100 pages on comparative Greek and Latin grammar. Thrilling read. But he's kind of talking about how they differ and kind of changes between them. But relatively early on in this digression, he talks about use. So he comes to this, and this is a transition that I'm going to use to introduce this quote that we're going to start with. So we should talk about use. Usage remains to be discussed. For it would be almost laughable to prefer the language of the past to that of the present day. And what is ancient speech but ancient usage of speaking? Okay. So he's just talked about how important it is to make sure that when we use a form, any form, spelling or the form itself, we consult the best authors. And the Latin word for that is the auctores. And you can actually see the English word kind of author in there, but it's more of actually the word auctoritas means authority. So in the Roman understanding, the auctores were men like Cicero or Caesar or Livy, kind of the greats. So that it'd be like today saying, well, is that the right grammar? Is that the right form? Is that, are you doing that right? And you would say, well, here's what Lewis does, and here's what Tolkien does, and here's what Chesterton does, and here's what Hemingway does. Any questions? And so that's actually kind of what's been guiding him the whole time is, you shouldn't spell it this way because Cicero spells it that way. Or you shouldn't spell it this way because Livy spells it that way, or whatever it is. And so, but then he comes to this question of, well, but as we talk about usage, an appeal to the past is fallacious, because then you're just saying, our usage should be the past usage. But then you come to the question, well, what was the basis of past usage? So you kind of end up in this logical circle. So he comes to this question, which I love. Not only linguistically do I love, because you'll hear your students say things like, well, everybody's saying it, or everybody's doing it, or everybody. So let me set up the quote and then we'll look at it. So he says this. So even when we're asking this question about usage, he says, here the critical faculty, i.e. our logic and our reasoning, is necessary, and we must make up our minds what we mean by usage. If it be defined merely as the practice of the majority, we shall have a very dangerous rule. Listen to this. I love this. Grammar and life. Ready? If it's just about the majority, we will have a very dangerous rule affecting not merely style, but life as well. Okay? So what he's saying is, right, we can't just go to the majority for grammar because we wouldn't go to the majority for what's the right thing to do. Now, of course, and as we're going to see, he's already set up the fallacy of the majority, right? Or democracy's fallacy, right? At our very core in democracy, we have this hope, I guess, that the majority is going to be right. Anyway, so he's asked this question then. So what I read transitions right into this. So I'm going to help us because some of this we haven't seen before, but I think we can figure some of it out. So he says unde, but we could, I think we've already seen the adverb ubi, so I'll just put that over it. Ubi. So he says, unde enim tantum boni. Do we know enim yet? Have we come across enim?
I think Madeline.
It's called a post-positive. Do you remember what post-positive means? Post-positive. After, and then positive actually means where it's placed. So enim is placed second, but we translate it first. And usually logical conjunctions fall into this category. I don't know why, but it's the same way in Greek. Quintilian. So anyway, so enim means for. So he's just drawing a premise. Why is it dangerous? For.
When.
Where. Where. Tanta means so much. So where, and we're missing the verb sunt. Where are tantum boni?
So much is good.
Okay, and now this is a masculine plural nominative. And he's doing what's called a substantival adjective. An adjective that's kind of acting like an adjective with a noun. So many
good
boni.
things.
Oh, but it's masculine.
Good men?
Good men, good.
Okay.
So for, because he's drawing this premise, or he's drawing rather the principle, for where are there so many good men, or good people, good citizens? And this ut sets up what's called a result clause. Now this is like chapter 32. But anyway, so that, or where are there so many men that quae pluciant. So have we met quae yet?
I don't think so.
Okay. It's called a relative pronoun. It means who or which or what, depending on kind of its context. So the thing that I teach my students to do when we first meet quae clauses, relative clauses, who, which clauses, and composition, is to kind of block them out. Okay? But in Latin, oftentimes this quae is going to do double duty. So we're going to see that in a second. So he says, for where are there so many good men that quae recta sunt, that, or those things which are recta. Think math. Recta.
Rectangular?
Yeah, what is a rectus?
Regular?
Yeah, regular, or even in English. What do we call those angles?
Right.
Right. right? So those things which are right, plakiant. So this is actually my subject. So for where there's so many good people, that those things which are right, plakeo.
Like placate?
Yes, it's related to the verb placate. And in Latin, we would just translate it please.
Huh.
So the things that are right, please.
The many?
The many, good.
A
Like
pluribus.
a pluribus, right? Out of many, one. So let's put it together and break down what he's saying. So, for where are there so many good men that the things which are right please the many, or please the majority? What's he saying?
If the people are a really good population, then what's moral will be preferred by the majority.
Right.
But he's kind of asking like a rhetorical question,
Yeah,
like
it
there's
is.
not a place like that.
That's exactly right. So actually what he's saying is, why is usage a terrible governor for how we speak?
You don't know if the population's always good.
And actually, like you said, you actually know the population is not, right? You know the vulgar is going to take over, right? So to speak, on the street, the vulgar rules, right? So Dickens, has very clear shifts when he's writing kind of upstairs characters versus writing downstairs characters. And that's what we would expect. Because there's nowhere where that which is right is pleasing to the majority.
Yeah. Who wrote that again?
This is Quintilian. Actually, just since the New Testament loves doing this, let me give you his vice list. Where Paul will have these vice lists of things that people are doing. Here are his vice lists of what the majority does wrong. The practices of depilation. I don't even know what that is.
It's always bothered me.
It's anyway, of dressing the hair in tears, fancy hairstyles, of drinking to excess at the baths. So getting drunk at a sports game, we could maybe think. Though, he says, though they've thrust their way into society, they cannot claim the support of usage, since there is something fault-worthy in all of them, blameworthy in all of them. Okay. So in one sense, so he wants to redefine the word usage, not as usage by the majority, right, but appropriateness. Appropriate usage. So just because a lot of guys get drunk at the public baths doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. So
can I ask a usage question? Then, because this is the Latin Vulgate,
yes,
this vulgar time.
yes.
What is that written like the correct usage, or like what the majority population?
It's I wouldn't be so hard to say that it's not crass in the sense that the spellings are wrong, but actually, like we'll see in today's lesson, the Vulgate is written in such a way that, and I want to say this very carefully because we're talking about the Bible, so I'm going to try to be very precise here. When you read Mark's Gospel in the Greek, you know you're not reading an educated man's writings. If you read Isaiah's poetry, or Jeremiah's poetry, or the book of Hebrews, whether it's in Hebrew or in Greek, depending on the book, you know you're reading an educated man's writings. Paul's writings are written differently. So it's like reading C.S. Lewis versus reading The Message or something like that. And I'm not picking on The Message, because it gets to a really interesting point is, though God is the author, right? The scriptures flow from God. They are God-breathed. Yet the identities of the authors come through very clearly. And what Jerome wanted to do, having read, I'm not a Vulgate scholar, but I've read a good chunk of the Vulgate. I think he was pretty carefully trying to the best of his ability, though Latin and Hebrew are very different languages, he was trying to preserve the original author's style. So that when you read, for example, if you read Mark in Greek, side by side in Latin, the preposition use is the same. It's just, there is as minimal interpretation going from language A to language B. And I think that's important. I think that's important for a couple of reasons. One is, where it is higher style, he does keep it higher style. But where it's lower style, he also doesn't try to dress it up and make it Shakespearean or something like that. And obviously not Shakespearean, that would be...
Right.
Anyway. But he's not trying to say, ooh, this is shameful. Mark spoke like a fisherman or something like that. Like, John is very easy to read, almost at sight. It's pretty easy to pick it up and just go, in the beginning was the Word. Anyway, so, and there are books in the Bible where you can see the style shifts. So anyway, I think that's important for a lot of reasons. I think it's important to know that when God breathed the Scriptures, he did not trump the author's personalities. He did not make them magically educated, so to speak. And Paul actually has a little comment about that where he says, I think he's talking about Apollos, that Apollos is great at arguing with the learned. I think is his phrase, and I'm sorry if I'm attributing something to Paul that I shouldn't, but I think he has that phrase, and it's just kind of, again, God's way of saying, hey, there are some people who are going to be out there among the commoners, kind of like a D.L. Moody type, who's like with the dregs of society, and then there are the people who, are going to be at the university, or are going to be at the Areopagus, and Paul was one of those guys, so I think he could kind of make his way among both, and Jesus could also, and so I think that's...
I do think it's interesting that fishermen were literate in the first century. I think that's worth contemplating all day long.
That is an interesting point, although we also have the question of the use of what's called an amanuensis, which would be like a scribe. And we know that was in practice because Paul actually in Romans, I think it's in Romans, at the very end of Romans, his scribe who's writing it, I can't remember his scribe's name, but anyway, he says, and I can't remember his name. I so-and-so greet you also. And so it's kind of almost like this, and me too. And then he steps back out. But if you read the whole letter, you would, he is fine as a scribe to say, I, Paul, such and such. And he's writing that, And Paul, in a couple of his letters, gives us a hint that maybe there's something wrong with his eyes. Because he says, see with what big letters I write this. And so there's maybe some hint that Paul, whether it's because of beatings or whatever it is, something's wrong with Paul. So there's maybe a medical condition or something like that.
Maybe that's why he needed a scribe.
Right, and why he needed a scribe.
Or he says, you pluck your eyes out and give them to me.
That's right, you're right, exactly. And where he also says, a thorn was given to me in the flesh. Yeah. And so you have kind of hints, and I wouldn't make a whole big deal about it. But, whether it's a fisherman or Paul or whoever it is, again, the Scriptures do not have a problem saying or using a scribe or different personalities and things like that. And I think it's good. The more we read Scripture, I think the more three-dimensional, ground-smelling it is, so to speak. I think it was Jonathan. I was reading Jonathan Edwards this week, and he was talking about his prayer life and how, as he would read through the Scriptures in Greek, almost every word would stop him in his tracks. And I think his phrase is something like, I wanted to get through more, but I kept getting arrested at each word, Yeah, that's what we want. We don't want to rush, we want to slow down.
That happens to me in Latin, but it's not
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kate.
Could you just repeat what the translation was?
Yeah, absolutely.
The Greek and whether you're reading the Greek or the Hebrew, that the translations are the same. Is that a particular translation of the Bible you're referring to? Yeah,
so that's Jerome's Vulgate. So the way, I think mine's in the car right now, but
I have one.
do you have it with you? So what you can do, and if you go on Amazon, I guess free shameless plug from Amazon, it'll be listed as the Biblia Sacra Vulgata, which is Jerome's Vulgate, to the best of our text critical ability. Jerome's Vulgate, so you can, which is his translation done in the 4th century, late 4th century, I think, early 4th century, anyway. And so, yeah, you can read it, his Latin from 1700 years ago. It's great. I would bring it, honestly, I would bring it to church, I would bring it everywhere, not just show off, obviously, but just you can see it, and it forces you.
Especially around dumb people.
Yeah, exactly. I'm reading my Latin. Oh, really? Could you translate that for me? Not right now. I don't want to. Anyway, but yeah, it's great. I mean, you can. I'm thinking we were in Romans 15.
So is it still? It's in Latin still.
It is in Latin. It is in Latin, and anyway, the first verse I turned to actually has another post-positive. But anyway, so it is definitely challenging, but if you were hearing a translation of it, you could track it, I think. So I want to make known to you all, brothers, the gospel which I have proclaimed to you all, and which you have received, in which you also all now stand. For through it you all have been saved, and for this reason which I have preached to you, if you hold on to it, and if you're, then you will not believe in vain. So anyway, you'd see the verb like credo, you all, credistis, you all have believed, and things like that. So you wouldn't do it that quickly probably, but that's okay. I'm good. That was kind of like a test for me. My heart's beating a little more rapidly. So anyway, you can get it. It's great. I mean, it is such a good friend to have.
I just asked about that because you were talking about the high and the low, and
Yeah.
I just didn't know where that would fit.
It's called the Vulgate because honestly, if you were trained in High Latin, with a couple of books as exceptions, you read it and go, some ignorant fisherman guy wrote this, and you. Yep, that's right. Look at Peter's writings, Although it's interesting, kind of to your point, Chris, it's interesting to think that things that, 2,000 years ago were looked down on as kind of the ignorant writings of fishermen, we now look at as extremely hard to understand. Mm-hmm. So Paul, I think it's in Romans where Paul says something like, you still are drinking the milk of the word and you should have pressed on to weightier things. And the milk that he lists are views on baptism. There are like big items. And we're like, that's like Christianity 101 for Paul. But anyway, I digress. Oh, one more quote on this from Socrates. Where would you go to, where would you find so many good men that the things that are right please the majority? And it reminds me of a line from, I think it's Plato's Apology, where Socrates is having this debate with this man, and this man, it's kind of putting Socrates on trial. And the man says, you, Socrates, you pollute the minds of the youth in Greece. And Socrates says, which is a great question, he says, out of everyone in Greece, I alone pollute the youth? And he says, yes, you alone. And Socrates says, what a city where only one man would be the polluter of children's minds, and which is kind of his way of saying, like, I'm sure it's just, and it's funny because he actually kind of walks through in his dialogue, like, what is more likely, that there would be many polluters of the children or just one? And he's like, just one. And he's like, what a world that would be. Like, I would gladly, live in a world where I was the only one polluting the anyway. And they kill him for it, nonetheless. Okay. So, questions on chapter 12 or any sentences that you found especially interesting or worth time to look over and slow down?
Can you do number 4 in chapter 12?
Yeah, number 4 in chapter 12.
It has one of those LA things.
Yeah. Now, one thing that we are going to get to, I don't know if it's just off camera, but we're going to look at a couple of different pronouns tonight. So, if you ever wonder about illet or ipset or forms of sui, which we'll get to, or sui, and is, id, we're going to get to those. So definitely stay tuned for that. Okay. So that was my blib for the video, I guess. Okay. So number 4, unless gains. Close my book. That's just what I wanted to do.
Not that one.
Number 4?
Okay. I must have different books.
Oh, she probably means practice and review.
Practice and review. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Iliad. Oh, still close. I see.
I was like, wait a minute.
Wait a second. We're close, but not quite. Okay. Adolescentes. Anos propter.
Oh, no, not that one either. That's
Propter.
okay.
What do you have?
That's number 5. It's okay.
You want number 5?
No, that's number 5.
Yeah!
It's okay. You can do that one too.
We'll do them all. Okay. Whoa. All right. Third time's a charm. Here we go. All right. Oh, good. And actually, autem, there's another post-positive. However, So it comes second, but we'll translate it first.
That really threw me for a loop too.
Oh, there is another notice in this line too. Oh my word. This is made to be a scribe's nightmare. Like identical constructions on following lines. That is not good. This is why a lot of scribal errors happen, actually.
Yeah.
Snooper. Okay. All right. So even though we're getting more advanced in Latin, let's keep the basics. Verb.
Venerunt.
Venerunt, good. Subject to the verb venerunt. Do we have a subject? Noun, subject, pronoun, subject. And again, sometimes demonstratives work as pronouns also.
I mean, I guess it's the...
Say it.
Illy?
Yeah, it is illy. Yeah.
That's confusing.
So, let's think about, why is it confusing? Let's diagnose it. So we know, our eyes are telling us, okay, venerunt is my verb, and I'm looking for a plural nominative, right? Now, here's where Latin syntax, which is just the order of a sentence, that word's going to become more and more important as we get deeper and deeper into Latin.
I thought Latin didn't matter.
That's the lie.
Oh, well, you told us that.
I know. So here's where, as we grow in ability, we grow in kind of fine-tuning our rules, so to speak, okay? So in one sense, I can, and if I'm reading poetry, I might have to kind of scramble up my word order, my syntax. But in a standard, and when I say standard, speaking of tradition and usage, Livy and Caesar. These are the guys I'm talking about. If I read Livy, if I read Caesar, what I'm going to find overwhelmingly is a basic structure that looks like this. Subject, noun, direct object, although these two could kind of switch. Prepositional phrases, prep phrases, and verb. Okay? These two could switch, and I purposefully actually did not look at the sentence again before I wrote that, because they can switch. So normally what I'm going to see is my verb is at the end of its clause, at the end of its sentence, if it's just one clause in the sentence. The subject, noun, or pronoun is fronted. Usually that's the case.
Right.
So we find our verb, venerunt. Okay, they came. Okay, who came? And my eyes are going to assume, or at least, first suspicion is going to go to the front. They came. And there it is. So autem, as I said, is called a post-positive. It's an adverb, or conjunctive adverb. This is kind of weird, but it's however. So I'll just label it actually as post-positive, because that's the big thing. So it's post-positive. However, they came. And now we've actually got a couple of prepositional phrases, right?
Yeah.
Nos is a prepositional phrase. Cum medica, and actually, eius is following it. So here, unlike, say, English, where we would never do this, but we actually have with a doctor, his. In English, we would never do that. But in Latin, actually, that's not super uncommon. So they've actually ended the prepositional phrase, not with a preposition, like we do in English, but actually with a genitive pronoun. Okay. So, however, they, nuper, adverb meaning recently, newly. However, they recently came. Now we've just got two prepositional phrases. Nos, to us, cum medica eius.
With her?
It could be her or it could be his. Either way. Doctor. They came to us with his doctor or with her doctor or with its doctor even, in theory.
Okay.
That is a very normal looking Latin sentence. Extremely normal. And actually in the Vulgate, at least in Mark, he actually usually sticks his subject noun after the verb. And so that's author's style. And so as you read, as you get better at reading, you'll go, oh, isn't that interesting? In Mark, Jerome puts the subject noun after the verb. Does he have to? No, he doesn't.
Right.
But you're learning style. And that's really important. That's one of the great things that Latin can teach you, is to really pay attention to even the order of words. I'll give you an example from Tolkien. Saruman, when he knows he has left the path of wisdom, and Gandalf tells him this, but Saruman says, if we go and we try to take the ring from Sauron, we would be doing maybe evils along the way. Maybe evils. And this is kind of a part of speech and a syntax issue. There's no such thing as maybe evils, right? Maybe is not an adjective. It's an adverb. And so in Saruman's construction, performing maybe evils, he's putting a word where it does not belong, and he's putting a word out of place. And that's Tolkien's way of telling you Saruman knows what he's doing is wrong. And so that little bit of syntactical change, I'm trying to remember the technical term for it, where you have irregular syntax. I can't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, that's what Tolkien's doing there. So, and sometimes authors will do things like that to emphasize a point. That we have to read very slowly to catch it. Have to read very carefully to catch it. Okay? Any others from chapter 12?
I thought those antique sentences were easier, honestly.
You did? They were pretty short. I like number 8. It reminds me a lot of, and I wonder if our founders were thinking of this when they signed the Declaration of Independence, right? I can't remember, and feel free to recall and correct me, but the last line is, "We who here affix our names pledge forth our sacred honor in our fortunes."
Oh, yeah.
Something like that. And again, I'm sorry, I know that's not verbatim, but number 8, right? "Illi non solum pecuniam, sed etiam vitam pro patria profunderant." They poured out not only their wealth, but even their life for their country. And again, our founders actually were known during the constitutional debates and Articles of Confederation debates. They were known to quote the Romans verbatim from Latin, and everyone, of course, could understand and translate. It's pretty amazing to us nowadays, especially. But again, they were very ignorant back then, and we're much more intelligent now. Anyway, the Senate floor. Oh goodness. Okay. It makes me sad to think of that. But that's okay. That's what we're in the process of doing, right? Okay, let's look at chapters 13 and 14. And they're actually going to go somewhat together, we'll see. As far as there's not a lot of difficulty here, but we can add some precision where maybe we haven't had it before. Okay. So I want to look at 2 big categories, demonstratives and pronouns. And I want to kind of show you the unique ways that they all work, but also actually the common ways that they all work. So let's take a sentence, a very simple sentence, and we're just going to take a present verb, umbelat, and we're going to swap out different pronouns and see how that sentence changes. Okay? So we're going to go with ille umbelat. We're going to go with ille vir umbelat. We're going to go with idem umbelat. We're going to go with ipse umbelat. We're going to go with is umbelat. We're going to go with, let's see, I want to make sure I didn't forget any of these that they want us to do. Okay, those are all the ones. Okay. So, at first glance, kind of from 10,000 feet, whatever, 30,000 feet, these are basically all working the same way. That is to say, they're all basically saying, he walks. Now, that is very simplified, but now what I'm going to go to, in one sense, is going to become more author-specific. Okay? So it becomes more about learning how your author writes. So the 2 top examples are obviously different, but here we go. Ready? Ille umbelat. He walks. Ille vir umbelat could be more of a that man walks. So, for example, if Cicero is in the midst of the Senate and he's denouncing Catiline, he uses ille often for Catiline. That man is the one. And so it's almost it's interesting, that's almost his intensive form. So even though we're going to see today that ipse is called the intensive, Cicero, often when he's talking about Catiline in the Senate, I can think of a number of examples where he uses ille basically as his intensive. That one. What should we do with this man who does these kinds of crimes? Illos, oh my goodness, crimes just split my head. Anyway, these kinds of crimes. And so he uses that often as kind of a demonstrative, but also an intensive. Idem we call the identical use. That same man. So for example, who is the man who has claimed to love his country? That same man who has done these horrible things, or something like that. So we call that the intensive, the identical. Idem. Idem. Okay. Now we haven't met it yet, but there's a word that's the opposite of idem, which is idem. Long I, D-A-M. Idem. I think it's actually short, idem. I gotta think about that. I'll have to look it up. Istem. I gotta think about this. Anyway, it means some guy. So it's the opposite of the identical. It's actually the unknown or the unspecified. Like there was some guy who went to the store. Idem. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's right. I'll check it out in a second. Okay. Ipse, like we said, is oftentimes the intensive. Ipse or ipse vir, this very man. So again, you see significant overlap between the authors with ille and ipse. And sometimes, again, ipse just works as he. That man, this guy. Ipse, this guy. And then last but not least, is almost always just a straight pronoun. He.
Is it always he, or can it be?
Is he. So is the feminine, id is the neuter.
Oh, right.
So yeah, these are just the masculine. I'm going to check myself on the spelling. Oftentimes I turn to be right and I just second guess myself. I have a feeling I'm actually wrong this time. Here it comes. Edom? Hold on. Istem. It's got to be under istem. I'm going to call it in a second. I don't even see it. So there you go. I'll have to find it some other time. I tried. All right. So these are kind of the pronouns that we've seen so far. Now I want to give two special uses that we're going to then get into. The first is ille, and I call it the flipper. One, because that's just more fun. Because you can just sing the song, they call him Flipper, Flipper, if you remember that old TV show. Okay. But it works basically as the latter, such and such. The latter. So I'll give you an example. Caesar sees Brutus, Brutum videt, ille non clamat. So Caesar sees Brutus. He, that is Brutus, because it is flipped our accusative, direct object, and made it our subject. Ille. So the latter, the last guy I talked about, Brutus, does not cry out. He doesn't, call them. Okay. So that's that's kind of the first special use of a pronoun or demonstrative that we've seen. Okay. The second one is going to be a special use of is. Okay. In English, we have a problem all the time. We're just often not aware of it. He punched him.
Yeah.
Who did he punch?
Him.
Who is him?
Some other guy. guy.
Okay, so this is the question, right? Who is the him? So in English, if we wanted to say, he punched
Himself.
there we go. Okay. So in English, though we have these forms of him versus himself, actually we're pretty sloppy with their use. For example, he took his book. He took his book. What's wrong with that? It's his book. But versus he took his own book versus he took his, meaning somebody else's book. Do you see the difference? So in English, the challenge is oftentimes we're not clear with what are called the reflexive forms. Okay? Reflexive forms. And here's our illustration. In Latin, we have special nouns and special pronouns that are reflexive. And here's what that means. It means our subject noun is looking into a mirror. And what is being reflected out when he does his action, if it comes back to himself, we need a reflective or reflexive pronoun. So, for example, he took his own book, or he slaps himself. Versus if, say, our subject noun looks into that mirror of action and it bounces off on some other person. And we call that non-reflexive. Non-reflexive. So, he sees him. Caesar sees him is anybody but not Caesar, right? He takes his book. Anybody but not our subject noun. Okay? So in Latin, is, ea, and id function as our non-reflexive pronouns. So for example, let's look at two sentence examples back to back to kind of illustrate this. Cupio. Okay, sorry. I did not use a first person singular. Cupit librum eius versus cupit librum sui.
And sui is the...
Sui is our reflexive.
Oh, it's reflexive.
Sui is our reflexive. Okay? So, cupit librum eius would be, he desires his book. And who's the his?
Somebody else.
Not the subject noun, right? It could be anybody else. Could be, again, the guy down the street or the guy at the library. I don't know who it is. But it's not the subject noun. It is non-reflexive. It's going somewhere else. Whereas the forms of sui, sibi, say, those are the forms, are always reflexive. He wants his own book. And so when we're writing in English, or when we're speaking in English, my challenge to us as speakers is to be very clear with our reflexive pronouns. I want my own way. Now that's a little bit, that's actually kind of emphatic, right? Because you could say, I want my way, and that's obvious. But, versus like, say, Levi, my son, Levi wants his way. That actually would be somebody else's way. Versus Levi wants his own way. So that's how in English even we can be precise in being either a reflexive, I love myself. He wants his own way. Versus he wants his way, i.e. Brutus wants Caesar's way or something like that.
Can you go through all the sweet things?
Yeah. So with say, or there are various ways to call it, but I usually just call it say because that's the most common form.
You mean you don't say sweet?
Sweet. No, because that's the genitive singular. It's just a weird form because there are no nominative forms.
Oh.
So that's where it's kind of funky to say, well, what do we call it? So you can just call it the reflexive pronoun. So is, ea, id is just is, ea, id. So eius, ei, eum, or ea, eum, or id, and then eo or ea. Okay. And I'm not going to do all the plurals for us here today. The reflexive pronoun has no nominative. And that would make sense because its only job is to point back to the nominative, not to be the nominative. Okay? It really doesn't have a separate function. So our genitive form of himself, or, by the way, the plurals are identical. So you'll either love that or hate that. Students, when they're young, they love that because then they have to memorize less. But as we get better, we're like, oh, it'd be really nice if they had a different form. But they don't. So, sui, sibi, say, say. So these are the masculine, feminine, and neuter, and the singular and plural. Sui, sibi, say, say. Sui, sibi, say, say. And they always work reflexively. They always come back to the subject. So, for example, he loves the people of his city. Of the city of himself. Urbis sui. Of the city of himself. His own city. He gave the rose sibi to himself. It was like a bad Valentine's Day. It takes me back to so much of my youth. Okay. He, amatse, he loves himself. Versus he loves him. Or her. Or secum, with oneself, omnia potes facere. A man can do anything. Okay? So they always, whether singular or plural, they're always going to point back to the subject.
Well, that's kind of easy to figure out if it's singular or plural, because you just look at the subject then, right?
That's exactly right. So and that's where it really doesn't matter. It's basically a mirror. I mean, it's just, whatever that subject is, going right back to it.
Can I ask you a question? So those are the reflexive ones. This is where I'm still sort of like
Yes.
foggy.
Yes.
These are the non-reflexive
That's
ones.
right.
And that's the nominative, genitive forms
Dative,
of...
dative, accusative.
What's the difference between is and it?
Masculine, feminine,
Okay.
neuter.
But then how about for the AUs thing?
Eos, do you remember the chapter on special eos
This is where
adjectives?
I had a lot of trouble.
Okay, so special eos adjectives. Okay, don't have a lot of trouble. I was just looking at, I don't know what I was looking at, but soli deo gloria,
Yeah.
right? Glory, dative, solely, to alone, God, or to only God. Glory to God alone. Solely is a special eos adjective. The dative, whether it's a masculine or a feminine or a neuter, is always going to end in a long I. The genitive, so it would actually be solius, of something alone.
So that could be like an illus or an illi. It doesn't matter. Like, you could put any of those beginning
Ilius,
words.
like here.
Yeah.
So, we could do...
but those are the endings we need to remember.
That's right.
Okay.
Solius, Ilius, ultrius,
Right.
etc. So all of those in that I can't remember if that's chapter 9 or 8 or wherever that was. But anyway, those all follow that same pattern. So their genitives for all genders are the same. And their datives for all genders are the same.
I just had those particular, endings.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
And then everywhere else it kind of declines normal.
Yeah.
Pretty normal. Neuters sometimes are weird. Like id or illid or istum or whatever. Okay? So these are the reflexive. So they give you a ton of sentences in chapter 13. They are so worth looking at, where they just kind of one after another. The Romans, so for example this one, the Romans praised say. What would that be? The Romans praised say. Themselves versus the Romans praised eos.
Somebody.
Them, right? Whoever the them is, it's not the Romans. Mm-hmm. Could be the Carthaginians, not likely. Could be the Greeks, also not likely. But anyway, it's somebody who's not the Romans. The girl saved say. Herself versus the girl saved am. Her, somebody else. Somebody who is not the girl. And this is where we don't know who it is, but we know it's not the subject now. Whoever it is. And this happens, again, in English. Kind of keep your ear open for it and see if you can hear where somebody means to use a reflexive and they don't. He came over and he grabbed his dog and, wait, grabbed whose dog? His dog or Johnny's dog? Oh, Johnny's dog. I'm sorry, I meant Johnny, And that's the issue there is he didn't grab Sui Cunham, the dog of himself. He grabbed Eus Cunham, not his own dog. So that's the way you could tell it. Okay? And then they give, we kind of already talked about it, but ipse as an intensive. Again, this is author dependent. Some authors will use it, he himself, ipse. Some actually won't. So those categories are there and they're good, but sometimes it's a little fuzzy around the edges as far as, again, Cicero might use ille instead of ipse. But then he'll also use ipse. So there is flexibility, and that's probably what frustrates you more than anything, is you want nice neat categories. And
my nice charts.
Yeah, right, you want nice charts. Well, actually, it's funny, I should photocopy for you a couple of pages where he talks about how many different paradigms there are, if you are a paradigm person, because he kind of rants on that for about 20 pages. So if you want them, I'll give them to you, and why that's a bad way to learn Latin, actually. So there you go. But I won't pick on you anymore. Okay, so chapter 14, this is a great example of really moving into non-vulgar Latin. So first, before we get to case use, they talk about I stems in the third declension. I stems in the third declension. Now, as readers of Latin, probably the most important thing that we do at the beginning, just like when we're learning English, is we want to be able to read another author's writings. It would be pretty daring right now for us to say, you know what I want to do tonight? I want to sit down and I want to compose a couple of lines of epic poetry. In Latin, right? I'm scared to try my hand at English some days. Many days, actually. I dared a couple lines today. Well, but it's terrifying, nevertheless, actually doing it in Latin. Anyway, all that to say is, so for us, the main thing we want to do is we want to be able to, when we're reading an author, just see what's going on there. So to that extent, or to that effect, rather, the third declension I stems. The most important rule for knowing if it's an I stem or not, besides just starting to catalog it in your mind, is if the noun follows the pattern is. So the rule that I have my fifth graders memorize is question mark in my mind, I stem. Is, I stem. And it doesn't matter if it's an adjective or a noun. Here's what that means. If when I look at the declension of the adjective or noun in the third declension, if it goes is, then it's an I stem. So what I teach the students is, so I'll put a noun up side by side. If the noun or adjective, when you look at it, if the nominative form and the genitive form are identical, ending in is, then it's an I stem. Is, I stem. Is, I stem. And that's only especially important in a couple of places. So I'm just going to highlight the couple of places where it makes a difference. The first is in the ablative singular, it's going to make it a long I instead of a short E. So instead of going X is E M E X, it's going to go X is E M E. So omni.
Right. I remember Madeline doing this.
Yeah. Or nawis, there it is. Is, I stem, nawi.
Yes.
And then, and actually kind of if you look at the theory behind it, you'll notice that actually there are I's or E's basically everywhere else. There's an I there already, omni, omnem, omnis. So there are already I's or long E's in a lot of places. And so the only other change is actually, for masculine and feminine nouns and adjectives, is here in the genitive plural. Omnium, of all, or of all the things. So that would be navium. Navium. Okay. And I'm going to switch to blue because in the neuter you have a slightly different problem. So I'll do my neuters in blue because that shows up all right on the video. This blue's dying. Excuse me. So I'm going to use a special noun that's going to help us remember from The Sound of Music How do you solve a problem like?
Maria.
Yes, Maria. Good. So the change is actually also in the nominative, accusative, and vocative, which is what we'd expect because neuters are always the same in the nominative, accusative, and vocative. We see Maria, or if that doesn't help you remember, you see an I before the A. Okay? Maria, Maris, and there's the other one, Mari. Okay? So that can kind of help you remember, oh, Maria, that's right, C's. Now we go in Maribus. Actually, that one's in a vocative. Or that's probably in an ablative, on the C's.
So how come that's an I stem if you... Okay,
this one is not an is I
right.
stem. Yeah, so the neuters change that up a little bit. And honestly, this is a great example where it's more about just kind of training your eyes to see that. Like, not getting thrown off, wait, IA, or IUM, wait a second, or long I, because otherwise what we would think is we would think that would have to be a dative, right? We think, oh, it's omni,
right.
dative singular.
Right.
So it's really more about loading up in your mind the potential that it actually could be either.
Right, it could be out.
That's really what it's about.
Yeah.
Which leads us perfectly into the last thing that we're going to cover. When we learn our cases, we learn very basic rules, kind of like syntax. We learn very basic, word order doesn't really matter. Well, actually, it does matter. It just matters not in the way it matters in English. So there's nothing wrong, I don't think, with telling students that, as long as you start to kind of wean them off of that eventually. So that's kind of what we're going to do a little bit here. So far, if I asked you, when do we use the ablative case, what would be your answer?
Ablative, like cum plus ablative?
Good. So far we would use ablatives as?
Object of the preposition.
Good. Object of the preposition. So this is how, when we first learn Latin, we think, right, subject nouns, nominative. And then we learn predicate nouns, also nominative. And then we learn genitives, possession, but there's a whole lot. And we learn datives, indirect object, which is actually kind of always true, except for a couple examples that aren't true. Anyway, so we get ablative and we go, ablative is OP, object of the preposition. And that's okay. That's where we start. But what we're going to see in chapter 14 is we're going to add a couple of uses to, if we put it this way, kind of the Rolodex of possibilities. That's a trademarked phrase, by the way. I'm just kidding. Okay, so when I see an ablative, what if I see an ablative without a preposition in front of it?
It could mean in, by, with, or from.
Good. So actually, that's the answer. We actually kind of in our mind go, what are all those prepositions that go along with ablative? And you see lists like this. Cum, right? Or ah. And let's look at these. I go to the store with my mom. Cum. Cum matre, with my mother, or with mother. And our category, what we're going to see is, cum is going to start to drop out. So they'll just say, I went to the store, matre. And we have to go, I know what this is. This is, and here's our first kind of official category. We call it the ablative of accompaniment. Ablative of accompaniment. And these are really fancy categories. I remember when I was first learning these in college, because I didn't get this kind of education. I remember thinking like, oh my word, our professor is so rough. He's making us parse our nouns. That's a second declension, masculine, ablative singular, from, ugger, meaning field, or whatever it is. And then he would say, and what use, or what function of the ablative is it? And you have to go, that's an ablative of accompaniment. That's a weird example, because that would be with the field. I guess he bought me with the field. Okay, so could work. Okay, so the first category is basically going to build off of our preposition cum. The second use of the ablative that they're going to teach us is called the ablative of means or instrument. Some grammars will call it means, some grammars will call it instrument. Okay.
That would be by?
Yeah, by. Or sometimes even really just an adverb. So it answers the question, It answers the question, using what, or I'm sorry, I said an adverb. It's almost really more of cum again. Using what did you put the screws in place? I screwed them in
with a screwdriver.
With a screwdriver. Ablative of means. And it helps to think of, I think, tools and instruments. With what did he play that beautiful sonata? With a piano. With a piano. And so again, instead of using our preposition cum, they'll just put the ablative there with something that could be a tool, with something that could be a means of accomplishing something. Now, this last one is probably the most challenging for students, but remember, this category is using what did you accomplish it? With a hammer, with a sword, with a dictionary, I don't know, whatever it is, okay? The last one is called the ablative, or the last one for this chapter is called the ablative of manner. And next to this one, I want you to write the question, how? How?
Well, that is an adverb question.
That's an adverb. That's a true adverb question. And actually, what's funny is this actually comes off of cum also. With joy. Joyfully. Now, did he use joy to accomplish something? No, he didn't. But he did it joyfully, and so we call that the manner in which something was done. Those two categories are the most challenging for us to kind of... But again, it requires us really just to be more precise. What is actually being said there? He observed the skies with a telescope. Which use of with is that? Instrument, right? What did he use? A telescope. How about with friends, one is never alone? Accompaniment. How about this one? I was going to do the ironic. Anyway, with a lack of sleep. Okay. Sleeplessly would be that one. Anyway, how about with courage, he fought his foe? Manner, right? So these are going to be kind of true adverbs. Courageously, virtuously, whatever. So something on that theme, kind of variations on that theme. But notice they're all actually coming off of, at least the first chapter, coming off of what we had seen with cum before. With my mom, with a sword, with virtue. So all of those before now had just kind of been an OP. But it actually is going to force us to kind of categorize and think, what's going on here? And the cool thing is as we add these, it'll again help us read more precisely. Because we can even start to bring these eyes to English. Because our Bible translators are doing the same thing. They are making this call. And so we even want to be aware of, oh, wait a second. With perseverance, patientia. With perseverance. Manner, right? Patiently or long-sufferingly, which is not a word in English, but that's the idea here. He didn't use patience like an instrument, and it wasn't with him like a buddy. We have no reason to believe that would be the case. But it was how he did it. How did he make it through? Cum patientia, or just patientia. So that's actually the only things in chapter 14 is we have, or rather are, the I stems, is, I stem, and then these different ablative case uses. Accompaniment, means, or instrument, and manner. Okay? Questions on those three?
So they are really sort of like prepositional phrases, just minus the preposition.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. And that is moving away from vulgar Latin. And you can kind of see it how, if I have that category in my mind, I'm just going to be on the lookout.
And you just sort of, in your head, you find the object of the preposition and you insert in your head the...
with. Yeah, right. You would there probably insert with. And again, so a big clue is the noun itself, right? So, for example, if we saw just the noun gluttio, what are our best options, or what is our best option for what gluttio could be?
Probably...
Ablative.
Yeah, ablative which two? Or which one?
Is it a gladiator, like a fighter?
Oh, gladius is a sword. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's a sword. Okay.
Means or instruments.
Yeah, means or instrument is probably going to be your best. He slew the foe with a sword, using a sword. But in theory, it could be a accompaniment, right? He journeyed across the land, gladio, with his sword. Could be, but just even the noun itself is kind of going to clue us into what is most likely to be in the category. And the context is going to make it, really, is going to be the final kind of clarity.
That's cool that gladiator is...
Yeah, literally, it's a sword user. Yeah, so it's funny. Gladiator is the most popular one that we know of, but they actually had different names depending on their weapons.
Ah. That's cool.
Yeah. All right. That's it. So chapters 13 and 14. I'll send out the key, upload the video. Kate, any questions? Oh, I think you're muted, or I've muted you, or you're muted. One or the other.
What should you YouTube to find the videos?
He sends the links.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
no
Okay.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. Take care.